The modern British are a nation of immigrants. This book spans a period of 1,000 years of their history. Its framework is the gradual transformation of mainland Britain under the impact of various invading peoples. The original inhabitants, the Celtic-speaking Britons, ancestors of today's Welsh, were overcome by the Romans after AD 43. There was initial bitter resistance, culminating in the savage revolt of Boadicea in 60 to 61. But for over 3 centuries, Britain was a relatively prosperous province of the Roman Empire. Between AD 400 and 500, the period traditionally known as the fall of the Roman Empire, the Romano-British society in lowland Britain, which had lasted over 300 years, was invaded and partially conquered by Anglo-Saxon immigrants who came from Denmark and Saxony. These 5th century invasions form the background of the period to which later traditions assign the wars of King Arthur, in which he defended British society against the invading English. Today we often use the terms British and English indiscriminately, but historically the British were the original islanders, and the English the Anglo-Saxon newcomers, and this distinction is used throughout this book. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Britain was swept by new waves of invaders from Scandinavia, the Vikings. They came for plunder, but most of all for land to settle and farm. At this time, a number of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms flourished in what was to become known as England. Most were destroyed by the invaders. The careers of the 3 greatest Anglo-Saxon kings, Offa, 757 to 96, Alfred the Great, 871 to 99, and Athelstan, 924 to 39, were all touched by the Vikings. To Offa they were a shadow on the horizon. To Alfred they were enemies in a life and death struggle. Athelstan was their conqueror and assimilator. The course of the Viking invasions left Wessex the chief power in Britain, and by 939 England existed in roughly the same geographic terms as it does today. But in the eastern and northern parts of England, the Vikings had settled permanently, irrevocably changing the character of the society. The heavy settlement of a Scandinavian free peasantry and warrior class in the Midlands and East Anglia meant that the Anglo-Saxon kings had to be an effective power there to outface the Viking kings from overseas. At first, the English succeeded, for example, procuring the downfall of Eric Bloodaxe, the last king of an independent Viking Northumbria, in 954. But failure to maintain this influence by Aethelflaed the Unready, 978 to 1016, led to the fall of the English monarchy and a generation of Danish rule under Canute and his successors. Although the line of Alfred was restored in 1042 in the person of Edward the Confessor, the royal house had lost its vigour. When Edward died childless in January 1066, a powerful earl with no great claim to the throne, Harold Godwinson, became king, only to fall in battle at Hastings the same year, fighting one of his rivals, Duke William of Normandy, the Conqueror. The Norman Conquest signifies the end of Anglo-Saxon England, though the English people still speak an Anglo-Saxon language, and their social and political organisation has its roots in the society founded in this island by Germanic invaders 1,500 years ago. As might be expected, the sources for such a long period are not only diverse, but variable in quantity and quality. We can divide them into 3 main categories: narrative history, chronicles, annals, histories; documentary records, laws, charters, wills, writs, Domesday Book; and material sources, coinage, metalwork, sculpture, manuscripts, embroideries, etc. In the last category, we might also include the whole range of archaeological evidence. Other kinds of sources appear in these pages, particularly literary compositions, poems, letters, saints' lives, royal biographies, but it is perhaps the chronicles and charters which require a brief explanation. Chronicles are year-by-year notes recording important events, accessions, battles, deaths, and so on. They are not shaped works which interpret history in the manner of the classical historians. They were perhaps originally jottings set down by monks in calendars and tables used to calculate the date of Easter. At first, they might be as simple as Day Dark as Night, Annals of Wales AD 447. Gradually, they give more detail. In this year, Aldfrith, King of Northumbria, passed away on the 14th of December at Driffield. Anglo-Saxon Chronicle AD 705. In 731, the first great work of English historical writing was published by a monk called Bede at the monastery of Jarrow in Northumbria. The ecclesiastical history of the English people transformed the bare framework of annals into a true historical synthesis with vision and style. Bede's work was to remain the framework for much that followed. For instance, he was the first to use dating by the Incarnation, AD, for historical purposes, and his book became the international bestseller of the early Middle Ages. Bede's sources were mainly oral, though he had access to documents from some of the English churches, notably in Kent. The classical tradition of historical writing was still known. For example, although Tacitus's works were not rediscovered until the Renaissance, Suetonius's biographies of the Roman emperors were very influential. They gave barbarian kings an idea of what a ruler should be, and they were also a model for a shaped work of history with a message which could serve the interests of a royal dynasty. These ideas grew stronger after the reign of Charlemagne in Francia, modern France, from 768 to 814, the epoch we now call Carolingian after him. Charlemagne's forceful and glamorous kingship was an ideal for later kings like Alfred the Great. Accordingly, a work like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, though based on earlier West Saxon monastic annals, becomes expansive in the Frankish style in the reign of Alfred in a way which suggests that it was compiled under Alfred's personal supervision in order to advertise the success of his own dynasty. Copies of the Chronicle, handwritten of course, were then disseminated to churches throughout England, and it survives in several somewhat different versions. Generally, I have not distinguished between them in my text. The later a chronicle is written after the event it describes, the less value it has. But that is not to say that some later chronicles do not sometimes preserve valuable material from sources now lost. For instance, early 13th century chroniclers from the Great History School at St Albans record what look like genuine 5th and 6th century Mercian traditions, and one of these writers, Roger of Wendover, is alone in preserving details of the death of Eric Bloodaxe in 954 from a now lost Northern Chronicle. The value of all such works depends on a combination of the circumstances of their composition and the sources and bias of their author. The most important cases are discussed in the relevant chapters. What makes Tacitus trustworthy on Boadicea, the Annals of Wales unreliable on King Arthur, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle ambivalent on Aethelred, and so on. Charters are a quite different kind of source. They are title deeds, the records of land transactions, for example, the gift of an estate by a king to a monastery. They may sound dry as dust, but they tell us a tremendous amount about the king's power and pretensions. They show us where kings did or did not possess land. They give us clues as to how they managed the royal estates. They enable us to trace the rise of the great families and the lesser military aristocracy. Charters can even give us insight into character. Offa's hard-nosed grasp of the workings of kingship, Athelstan's love of high-flown titles, Ethelred's self-justifying ineffectiveness. Anglo-Saxon charters date from before the period of systematic governmental archives and were preserved in the muniments rooms of the local bishoprics. They were often copied and recopied, and most only survive in later copies, which are often tampered with and usually corrupt. But charters are one of the prime sources by which modern historians have been able to build up a picture of the fabric of Anglo-Saxon society. There is now debate about the roots of English and British identity. This book centres on the emergence of the English state and an English identity during the Dark Ages. The nature of this legacy is now of interest to all inhabitants of the British Isles and indeed to a wider world.